Hi everybody. Welcome to Balloons, Bottles, and Bread. My name is Will. I'm here with my friend and fellow scientist, Nate, and we are from CLEAR, which is Communication Literacy and Education for Agricultural Research at UC Berkeley. Our mission is to try and go out into the public and tell everybody about the cool research that's being done in agriculture, and even things that expand a little bit beyond that to science in general. My background, I come from Colorado. I am a third year in plant and microbial biology. I'm a PhD student, and generally I study plant metabolism. So how plants take in nutrients to grow, like how does a seed go from a seed to a giant redwood?
Hi everyone, I'm Nate. Thank you all for joining. I'm a second year PhD student, and I'm focusing mainly on understanding the plant immune system. But in my free time, I make a ton of bread. And before starting my PhD, I worked in a couple of bakeries. And so I have some experience making bread in that regard too. So thanks again. And Will, I'll hand it off to you to get started. I'll mainly be monitoring the question and answer function of this. So if you have questions, go ahead and post them. And I'll try to get an answer to you.
Great, thank you, Nate. Okay, so today we are going to learn about how yeast works, what exactly yeast is, and what sort of function it plays in bread making. And so to start us off, we're gonna have a little bit of an activity. And this activity is gonna run over the course of this presentation. So we're gonna start it now, and then we're gonna check back in on it later on towards the end. And so I'm going to run through the instructions just really quickly so that you can follow along at home if you have all these materials handy. If you don't have them handy, don't worry at all. All these materials are available on the BASF website. You can just click the link and download it to see the instructions. And all these materials are pretty easy to find. So you're going to need some yeast, some sugar, some warm water, a large rubber balloon, and then a glass or plastic beverage bottle. And what you're going to do is you're going to take out your balloon. You're going to stretch it out a little bit, maybe blow it up a couple times so that it is loose, a little bit loose. And then you're going to add an entire packet of yeast and sugar to a cup of warm water, but that's not too hot. You're going to stir it to dissolve it. And then you're going to pour that mixture into a water bottle. Just a plastic water bottle works just fine. And then you're going to put the balloon over the top, and then we're going to wait. So I am going to stop sharing my screen just briefly to give you all a good demonstration. So I have all these materials with me right now. I have my water bottle right here. I have my balloon. I have a cup of warm water. I have something to measure out my sugar with. I have my sugar, and I have a packet of yeast. I am using some rapid rise instant yeast. You can use other types of yeast. I've found that this one tends to work the fastest in this demonstration, but if you have a different type, don't worry, that'll totally work as well. And so I'm just going to go through this really fast. Now, this water is at about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I just measure that with my little thermometer. You don't need a thermometer. You can kind of use the finger test. If it seems like warm water that you would like to maybe have a bath in or get in, that's great. If it hurts a little bit, that's probably too warm. You want it to be just the right temperature for the yeast. So first, what we're going to do is I'm going to take some of my sugar, and I'm going to measure out 2 tablespoons worth of sugar. And I'm going to try not to get it all over my desk, but I might in the process. That's a heaping tablespoon. That's fine. I'll do that one more time. Great. And I've just put them right into my warm water. Maybe I'll give that just a quick stir. Make sure it's slightly mixed. And then I'm going to take my yeast. And these are hard for me to open, so I'm going to use some scissors and not get yeast all over my desk. And I'm going to take that yeast, pour it right into that sugar water mixture. Seems good. And then I'm going to start stirring. Okay. You don't have to stir too vigorously. You just want to make sure that there are no big clumps in there of either sugar or yeast. And it'll turn to this nice kind of brown soupy color. It might not look too appetizing, but I think it actually smells really good. It smells like bread to me. Okay, so that is all nicely mixed up. I'm going to take a paper towel here for my spoon. And then very carefully, this is probably the most precarious operation here, I'm going to pour my mixture of warm water, yeast, and sugar into my plastic water bottle. Yeah, this looks really appetizing. Okay. Got a couple clumps there, but that is totally all right. And now here is my balloon. I blew it up a couple times previously, and I'm stretching it out just a little bit now. And also very carefully, I'm going to put my balloon over the top of my water bottle, and I want to line it up just so that we can see. Yeah, right there. So it's kind of over the center of the top right there. So it can also be handy to have a funnel if it's hard to pour into this water bottle. I had a fine little container here with the spout, because you don't really want to get water everywhere. But if you do, that's okay, because it's just sugar, water, and yeast. And so there we are. So now we have this kind of goopy mixture of yeast and sugar and water, and we have a balloon on top. And now what we're going to do is we're going to watch this over a period of time. And while we do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in this bottle. So I have a little presentation to show all of you. You should be seeing my screen right now. And first off, let's think about what yeast actually is. So here's a nice image of some yeast. Does anybody have an idea maybe in the chat of what yeast actually is, what kind of organism it is? Any ideas from anyone? Let's see. Yeah, okay. I'm seeing microbe, bacteria, could be bacteria, fungus, bacteria. So we have a lot of things saying maybe bacteria, maybe fungus. It is, in fact, a fungus. So good job, everybody. Bacteria was also a really good thought, because it's really, really small. It's a microbe. So that's a really good answer. So humans are made up of trillions and trillions of cells. I think 37 trillion cells or something like that. Yeast is a single cell organism. It's a fungus, and it grows by budding. So there are a lot of different types of yeast in the world. There are 1,500 different species of yeast, at least. We only use a couple of them. S. cerevisiae is the one that we use in baking. It's also used in brewing. And so I mentioned that it buds. And what does that look like? Well, here is a microscopic image of some yeast, or a video, I guess, of some yeast growing. And this is in a solution much like our own, a mixture with sugar, which is their food source, and some warm water. And so just like humans can eat sugar or any other nutrients and we grow, yeast eats sugar, and through some biochemical reactions, a type of metabolism within the yeast, it converts that sugar into a little bit of alcohol and a lot of CO2, carbon dioxide. And so when it does that, it starts to replicate itself. Here, if you can see my cursor, there's another bud forming on that little string of yeast. And it does this over and over again to grow and divide. So yeast are really helpful for us and really important in bread baking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about bread and some of the history of bread. But I want you to have in the back of your mind this video of yeast growing. How does yeast growing, how does their eating sugar and spitting out maybe a little bit of alcohol and CO2, how does that help us in bread baking? Why do we even care about that? And so I'll talk a little bit about bread, and keep that in the back of your mind. And then at the end, we're going to put it all together. So bread baking is a very, very old activity. It's been around for a super long time. Does anybody have any ideas about how old bread baking actually is? I could take any guesses. There we go. Yeah, somebody says thousands of years old. Somebody says 1400s. Bread was definitely around in the 1400s. Somebody says millions of years. That's another good guess. Somebody says 2000 years old. So a lot of really good guesses there. As it turns out, bread baking might actually predate modern agriculture, which is a crazy fact that I learned. So we have found in archaeological digs, not I myself, and probably not Nate either, but people have found in archaeological digs some charred crumbs of a flatbread, which is an older type of bread that we still make today, that were around 14,000 years old. So this is before we even domesticated a lot of crops. So bread baking really took off though as soon as we started domesticating some plants. So here is a nice image of the Fertile Crescent. This is maybe a term that some of you have heard before. The Fertile Crescent is an area of the Middle East where agriculture began, one of the first places that agriculture began. So this isn't the only place that it began, of course. There are a lot of other places, at least 11 others, I think. China also started agriculture, India, North America, Papua New Guinea. But this seems to be, as far as we can tell, one of the first places that agriculture began. And agriculture is just generally cultivating crops to use for human uses, maybe making fibers for clothing or building material, or using that grain as food. And so one of the first things that was domesticated over here was wheat. And wheat is super helpful in making bread. You take that grain, you grind it up to make flour, and then using some other techniques that we'll talk about, you can essentially bake that into bread. And so, as I mentioned, bread is at least 14,000 years old, but at least 9,000 years ago, bread was starting to be made in this area with domesticated crops like wheat. This is actually so long ago that the coastline has even changed. If you look right down here, the Persian Gulf used to extend all the way inland like that. It's now maybe 50 or 100 miles farther out just because of how long it's been. The rivers have been washing all that sediment down there. And here is just another example. This is from an ancient Egyptian tomb around 2,500 years ago. And even then, there are some depictions of ancient bread. So bread has been around for a very long time. But it didn't stay just in the Middle East. So a lot of us eat bread today, and it spread out from the Middle East all around the world. There we go. So here is an example of bread that we can find in Somalia. This is sweet fried bread in Somalia. Here is some naan that you might know from India. Here is a traditional Moroccan bread, a pretzel from Germany, if you've had any pretzels. And this is something called taba naan, which is a Kazakh bread. And so it has, from its inception in the Middle East, bread baking kind of spread all around the world as people established trade routes and kind of talked to each other about what sorts of things they were doing, what sorts of things they were eating. This kind of also mirrors the rise of agriculture around the world as wheat seeds that were taken from the Middle East found themselves all the way up in Europe, all the way across Africa, and then moving in through Iran and Afghanistan over to India. Oh, and if you look at my video, if you have a thumbnail of my video on your screen, you'll see that that balloon that we just put on the top of our water bottle suddenly inflated itself, which is kind of interesting. So I'm gonna think about that for a little bit. So as I said, there are a lot of different types of bread in the world. Here is just a quick representation of some of the things that we have, some that you might be familiar with, some that you've probably never heard of. There's a fougasse right here. There's some challah bread. Maybe that looks like some rye bread, and even an English muffin, which is something that you might be familiar with. But generally, there are a lot of different types that have come from this original creation in the Middle East. And so bread is around in a lot of different cultures nowadays. I'm going to show you some breads that you might be familiar with. These are all different types from a lot of different cultures. And there are actually so many types of bread in the world that I couldn't even begin to go over all of them. Some European breads that you might know. This is just a croissant from France, a baguette, which you're probably familiar with. Here are some pretzels from Germany. Those probably look a little bit familiar. And here again is some challah bread, or it's also a bread that you find in Poland. And a lot of cultures have developed around bread, used bread as even a traditional greeting. So in some Slavic countries, a traditional greeting is to give bread and salt. But again, definitely not limited to Europe in any way. So I decided to take just a very small sampling of bread from around the world to show you what kind of varieties there are. And even looking just at India, there are so many different types of bread that it's difficult to even start cataloging them all. So I think this is batura bread. This is some roti. We have some dosa, which I think is a little bit sweeter, some luchi. I think that's parota, kulchas, and then naan, which you might be familiar with. And this is just only in India itself. And there's a Wikipedia list, if you're curious, to see all the hundreds of types of bread that people have developed all over the world. And it's not even limited to India or Europe. So you might, if you've been out to an Ethiopian restaurant or have been to Ethiopia itself, there's injera, which is another type of bread. It doesn't look exactly like the bread that we are familiar with, but it's made from teff flour, which is a type of grain. It's not even made from wheat. So you can make bread from things other than wheat, right? There's mantu, which is Chinese. It's a steamed bread, which is kind of different from things that we might be familiar with. Tortillas, which I've definitely had a lot of. These were actually created in Mesoamerica. They're nahuatl. And also cornbread. This is a North American type of bread made from corn. You don't even need wheat. But generally, bread making from its creation in the Middle East has spread all around the world. And so now to connect this back to yeast, why might yeast actually be useful in bread making? Does anybody have any ideas? Why would we use yeast to make bread? Okay, I see somebody saying rise. Interesting. Yeah, to make it rise. To make holes. I'm seeing a lot of good ideas in the chat. Yeah. Right. So this is great. You guys are all putting this together so fast. So here is an image of flatbread. So this is bread that's made without using any yeast. And you can see that it's completely flat. And that's exactly where yeast comes in. Yeast can make some nice big holes in bread. So I even have an example here with me. Here is just some olive bread that I've been munching on lately. And if I hold it up very close, you can see that it's totally full of holes, and also some olives, because I think olives are very tasty. So yeast makes these holes in bread. Now, why doesn't it just bubble all out? It has these bubbles, and these bubbles are retained in the bread. They don't just kind of bubble and fizz away. Does anybody have an idea of why there are so many holes in bread? It definitely has to do with the CO2, right? We know that the yeast is eating a bunch of that sugar. It's making a tiny bit of alcohol, but it's also making CO2, which is a gas and expands like a bubble. But why are these bubbles trapped in the bread like that? Yeah, definitely. It's definitely making holes. Oh, you have to bake it. Yeah, that's a good thought. The crust. Ooh, that's a good thought. I'm seeing a lot of good ideas in the chat. Another one, I don't know. Yeah, that's totally fine. As scientists, Nate and I don't know a lot of things, but we do science to figure it out. I see something about it's trapping the gas. That's a really good thought. Depends on the yeast. Yeah. So it depends a lot on the type of grain you're using. So some of those other pictures of bread that I showed, they looked a little bit flatter, or the holes were a little bit smaller. And that depends on something that's in the grain itself. And so you might have heard of gluten before. So there are a lot of things that are gluten-free these days. Gluten is it's a number of proteins within wheat flour. So within a single seed, remember we grind up all these seeds to make flour. When a seed wants to grow, it needs a source of energy to actually do that. And so these proteins, I have here gliadin and glutenin, these proteins act as a food source for that seed. They're essentially these carbohydrates. They're basically full of sugar. And some of them are very long and some of them are a little bit different shape. And they give the seed all the energy it needs to start growing. But when we grind up all those seeds, we release all of these proteins. And when you add water, those proteins bind together and they make a mesh structure like you see here. And so that mesh structure is actually what traps that CO2. I saw a lot of ideas in there about how the CO2 is creating bubbles and they need to get trapped by something. Maybe it's the crust, maybe it's something else. This is actually one of the main things that traps those CO2 bubbles. So wheat flour tends to have a lot of gluten in it, a lot of glutens, and all of these bubbles are caused and retained by the glutens forming a mesh network around the CO2 that's being generated by that yeast. And that, when you bake it, is what makes yeast rise, or makes bread rise, sorry. So now we can think about what we have going on here. So what is happening in our water bottle? I think hopefully we've all put this together by now. My balloon is really starting to expand here. And just as an example, before this presentation, about half an hour before, I started another balloon just in case this one didn't work. And here it is. It's much bigger. You can see that everything has foamed all the way to the top and it's even gone into the balloon itself. So we have a lot of yeast at the bottom there working really hard. And then we have a lot of the foam and the bubbles that are coming up. So what's happening in this water bottle is exactly what's happening in bread when we start to bake it, right? The yeast is eating all of that sugar that's in the warm water, and it's putting out a lot of carbon dioxide, which is starting to fill up our balloon right here. Now, I'm not going to take this balloon off, but if I did, then it would smell probably a lot like bread. So now, just to see how well we understand what's going on here, I'm going to ask you guys a few questions that we can all think about together. So what would happen to our balloon experiment if we added salt instead of sugar? Do we have any ideas? If instead of adding any sugar to our water mixture, we just added a bunch of salt, how would that work? It won't eat it. It wouldn't go up. The balloon wouldn't go up. The yeast would die. It would definitely, I see it would taste bad. It would definitely taste bad. The yeast would die. Yeah, the yeast definitely wouldn't be very happy if there was only salt in there, right? No rising. Exactly, because remember the yeast is eating up that sugar as a source of energy to make that CO2. And if there were just salt in there, the yeast wouldn't really be able to do anything, right?
Hey, Will, we have actually a great question, two
Ooh,
great
yes.
questions related to that. So how does yeast rise in bread that doesn't have added sugar?
That is a good question. Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah. Nate, do you want to take this, being the bread expert that you are?
Sure. So in the flour, there are basically sugars that come from the wheat. So they're not the same as the sugar that you drink in soda or put into cookies or however else you use sugar. But the yeast is able to eat those sugars in the flour. But
Yes.
without the flour, in just water, the yeast won't have anything to eat.
Yes, good question. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So kind of in a similar vein, what would happen if the water were really hot? We used warm water here. How would it work if the water were really hot? The yeast would die, right? So we don't like hot water, not really hot water anyway. Neither does yeast. Yeast is a single-celled organism. It wouldn't really survive terribly well in really hot water. Now, what if the water were really cold? Any ideas there? Seeing a lot of similar things. Yeah, the yeast might freeze. Yeah, if the water is too cold, if we have ice in there, then the yeast are probably going to die because it's way too cold, right? Now, interestingly enough, and this is another experiment that you can do at home, if the water is cold but not cold enough to kill the yeast, the reaction actually slows down. The yeast can survive, but it's so cold in there that it can't, its metabolism slows down. You might think about yourself, if you're really cold, you kind of start moving very sluggishly. It's kind of similar with the yeast. They can't eat all the sugar quite as quickly. And so I mentioned that there have been flatbreads that were made for a long time. And now all of a sudden we have all this bread that we use yeast to make. But where did yeast originally come from? Does anybody know? How did we get yeast? I have this packet of yeast here, but like, where did I get that? Someone says mushrooms. That's a fun idea. Yeah, we know that yeast is a fungus. It's kind of a mystery, huh? Someone says from the store. Yes, I did technically get this yeast from a store before there were stores. Where could it have come from? It's grown. Yeah, exactly. So these are actually all pretty good answers. Yeast is in the environment all the time. And Nate, if you have anything you want to say about sourdoughs, maybe now is a good opportunity.
Sure. Yeah. So sourdough bread is something that's really common in the Bay Area, and one of the reasons why it's common here is because there is lots of yeast that occurs naturally in the air here. And so sourdough bread uses yeast that are in the environment to make bread instead of adding yeast that you buy at the grocery store. So you start with water and flour, you grow the yeast out of the air into that mixture, and then you use that mixture to make bread. So you're really just making bread out of flour and water, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that's basically how it was originally done. People way back ages ago might have noticed when they were making some sort of flatbread that when they left that mixture out in the environment, it started to rise a little bit. And that was really just the wild yeasts that are around us all the time. So remember earlier when I said that there were 1,500 species of yeast, they're around us all the time, all around. And you can use those to make your own yeast culture that you can use again and again to bake bread. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. If you weren't able to follow along, again, we have all of these instructions on our BASF website, and we have more activities at clearproject.org/resources. Thank you everybody for coming. If you have any other lingering questions, Nate and I will be here to answer them, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.